So we finished placing our waistband onto our model. We've got our waistband and our facing. We've got all of our measurements added to the waistband. We have our extension made, and that extension is hanging out back here. And we've attached that waistband to the measurement that we added to our model first thing. Let's tackle creating the circle skirt. Now I'm going to move fast, just follow along with me, and I'm going to explain how to draft the circle skirt with a single seam. So I'm going to show you how to draft a circle skirt with the one seam at center back, and then later I'll show you how to draft a circle skirt with 2 or more seams. Now I'm going to be doing a little bit of math here, just follow along as best you can. I'm going to use my Edit Pattern tool to select my waistline, my waistband. I see that's 29 inches for my waistband. Now when I go to make my circle skirt, when I cut out the waistline of the circle skirt, I'm going to be cutting on bias. So there will be a lot of ease in my fabric. So I'm going to take 29 inches being my waistband measurement. Your measurement might be different. I'm going to subtract 1 inch for stretch. So that takes me down to 28 inches. I'm then going to add my desired seam allowance around center back. And I want to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance on either side of center back. So I'm going to add 1/2 inch plus 1/2 inch, which brings me back to 29 inches. I'll show you really quickly how this works. I'm going to show you a couple examples. Here is my ellipse tool that's going to be hiding underneath your polygon tool. So click and hold on the polygon tool to choose the ellipse tool, and click once in the 2D window. Now I want to make a 29-inch circumference circle. So I'm going to choose circumference radio button, 29 inches, click OK. From here, I want to add my skirt. And I have to go back to the measurements that I first took on my half scale form, which was 10 inches for length of my skirt. I'm going to double that for full scale. That'll be 20 inches. And I'm going to use my transform pattern tool to, the edit pattern tool, excuse me. Once I have this ellipse made, choose the edit pattern tool. With the ellipse selected, you can just click and drag a box around it to select it. Right click on one of these highlighted edges. It's got to be on the edge. And this contextual window should pop up. I'm going to choose offset pattern outline. Again, that's select that ellipse, right click on one of the edges and choose offset pattern outline. And I want to extend my pattern by 20 inches, full scale 20 inches. Number of offsets I'll leave at 1, and I want to make sure that the create internal line checkbox is checked, and click OK. Now this is a really quick way of creating a circle skirt without having to calculate circumference and circumference diameters and radii. But I will show you why it's not the best method for doing so in just a moment. But this is a quick and easy way for getting a circle skirt without having to do too much math. You just need to know the waistband, subtract 1 inch for stretch, and then add back your seam allowances, whether that's 1/2 inch, 1 inch, or 3/4 of an inch. Now, why would we need to add that seam allowance back into that measurement? I'll show you why. I'm going to go in here and cut out my waistband, my waistline. You can see right now we just have a solid ellipse and there's nowhere to fit her waist into this garment. So I'm going to get my transform pattern tool. Make sure nothing is selected. You can just click anywhere out in space. Select the internal circle that's sitting in the middle here. Right click on one of its edges and choose convert to hole. That cuts a nice hole out of our circle skirt. Now, with my internal polygon or line tool, I'm going to click once on this vertex here and then double click on this vertex here. That kind of indicates where my center back seam would go. Excuse me. If I cut this seam, I can cut that seam. You can see here it is. It's 2 separate pieces. There's a gap in there, but there's not enough space in here to add seam allowance around my pattern for my final print of my pattern. If I go to print my final pattern on fabric or on pattern paper or plotter printer, I don't have enough room for that seam allowance, which is why I added that extra inch of seam allowance in the measurement of this internal circle in here. I'm going to undo that. I want to make sure that that seals back together. I don't want that cut. But I do want to keep that line because that's going to indicate where my center back seam is. If for some reason you've undone it and this line has disappeared, we can always remake it with the internal polygon line tool. Click once on this dot, that vertex, double click on that vertex, and it'll bring that line back. So from here, I want to remove that seam allowance that I just added. When I made this calculation for the circumference of this circle, I added my seam allowance, which was 1/2 inch on either side of center back. So I'm going to remove it now, because otherwise we wouldn't have room to put it in there. With this line selected with the edit pattern tool, I'm going to right click on it and choose offset as internal line. Now I had a 1/2 inch seam allowance on either side of center back, so I want to make sure that I'm offsetting by 1/2 inch, 0.5, and I want to add this to both sides of center back because this would be my center back, and I want to remove 1/2 inch from one side and 1/2 inch from the other. And I don't want to extend it because you'll see that it's extending all the way past into the center front of my skirt. I don't want that, so I'm going to unclick extend. So one offset, 1/2 inch. Now, if you've got a different measurement, it may not be 1/2 inch. You may have a 3/4 inch seam allowance. I want to extend it on both sides of that line, and I don't want it to extend all the way. So, okay. So now I've got my center back seam, and I've offset it on either side by 1/2 inch because I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. What I want to do is chop out, I want to cut along these two lines, but one of the issues that I ran into was those lines don't extend all the way to the waistline. So I'm just going to drag these points, make sure just the point is selected. Otherwise, if you have the whole line selected, it's going to move the whole line. Zoom in, select these points, and drag them past that waistline, that internal circle. Once that's done, you can select each one with the edit pattern tool. Select, shift, and select. Right click on either one of those lines and choose cut. That'll take out that extra seam allowance, and you can select it with the transform pattern tool and delete it. Now we've got plenty of room so that if I go in here and add a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I've got plenty of room in here to make room for that seam allowance on my final pattern. I'm going to show you that one more time with a different seam allowance. I'm just going to delete this and show you one more time how that goes about happening. So one more time, let's assume 29 inch waistband minus 1 inch for stretch. And let's say I want to do 3/4 of a seam allowance, 3/4 inch seam allowance at center back. So 3/4 of an inch plus 3/4 of an inch is 1.5 inches. So that's 29 minus 1 inch is 28 for stretch, plus 1.5 inches for seam allowance. That would be 29.5 inches. So my ellipse tool, click once in the 2D window, circumference, 29.5, okay. And then I'll extend that, the edit pattern tool, make sure that is selected, right click on one of the edges, choose offset pattern outline by 20 inches, extend by 20 inches, create internal line is checked, click OK. I'm going to use a transform pattern tool to select this internal circle, right click on it and choose convert to whole. Make sure that's the only circle selected, convert to whole. Go to my internal polygon or line tool, that's G on the keyboard. Click once at this point, double click at that vertex, and then I will offset on either side using my edit pattern tool, right click to offset as internal line, and now I've got a different seam allowance, 0.75 inches on both sides. Don't extend it or else it goes all the way through the lines. We don't want that. I've tried choosing the internal lines. Oh, did it work? Maybe it worked. Click OK. No, it still doesn't extend it properly. So I try to extend it to expand to the waistline, but it doesn't do what I need it to do. So I'm going to click on this point, drag it somewhere past that line, select both of these internal lines, right click, and cut. So it chops out that little piece. Use my transform pattern tool, that's keyboard shortcut A, select that little sliver and delete it, get rid of it. Now again, I've got space so that if I want to add a 3/4 inch seam allowance, I've got plenty of room to do that. Now that is one of the troubles of drafting a circle skirt with one seam in center back. But I'm going to go ahead and attach it to the waistband so you can see that. Transform pattern tool. I'm going to tumble my view to one of the sides. I can also press the number 4 or the number 6 on my keyboard to get to one of the left or right side views. With my circle skirt selected, I'm going to rotate it along this red rotational guideline so I can get it horizontal. And then from my front facing camera, that's number 2 on your keyboard, I can drag this into place. And then I'm going to check to see what it looks like from the top. That's 5. Drag that into place around her waistline. And I'm going to sew it to my waistband. There we go. Just drag that into place. I'm going to sew this to my waistband. Now there's a couple of ways you can sew it. You can sew it in the 3D view or in the 2D view. That's up to you. I'm going to use my free sewing tool. That's M on the keyboard. And I'm going to start, I do want to sew this to the waistband. It can be the waistband or the waistband facing. It doesn't really matter. All right, I'm going to start from this end. I'm not including my extension. The extension is only there for closures and whatnot. I'm going to start from this end and work my way in this direction, and I'll tell you why. If I start from here and go this direction, you'll notice those tick marks stay in the same place. I end up with the tick marks stuck right over here. And then if I go to select my sewing relationships to change it in the future, I won't know which sewing relationship I'm clicking on, whether it's the one holding the facing in place or the one holding the skirt in place. So instead, I'll start here and work my way in this direction. Click once, click again. That way my tick mark stays over here and I can easily select it in future. Now I need to go over here, and this is a 50-50 shot. I'm going to try it this way just so you can see what happens. Click once, click again, and you're going to see all these crisscrossed pieces. The good thing with working with a single seam on your skirt is that it's really easy to tell whether you've sewn it properly. There's something going on here, so that's not what we want to do. I can reverse my sewing, or I can just undo it. Let's try that again from the extension edge all the way to center front, and then I'll start from this point and work my way in the opposite direction. Click once, click again. That looks much better. I'm going to go ahead and sew my 2 center back seams together with my segment sewing tool. Click once, click again. That should be good to go. I'm going to turn my little avatar back on. That's over here in the avatar display, show avatar. And now I'm going to simulate. You should see that stitched together. And then her arms always get phased. They always phase through the skirt. It always happens with a circle skirt. It's totally normal. While we're simulating, as long as the simulation is still going, just use your select move tool to grab that fabric and just drag it through her arms. Totally fine. She's fine. She'll be fine. There we go. And you can always kind of fluff it out a little bit. There. There is our circle skirt. Now you may have a different measurement. Yours might be longer. Yours might be shorter. It's totally up to you what size you want to make this. I'm going to stop my simulation. Now I've got seam allowance in mind. I'm just going to get rid of that so we don't get confused, because that's a different thing. We're going to get to seam allowance in a second. You can always extend this. You can make it a little bit larger, but doing so is tricky. We can select these pieces. Come on. 1, hold shift, 2, 3, 4, right click on it, offset pattern outline. So you can extend it a little bit more, but you can see it's doing strange stuff here. This needs to be extended. There we go. So if you needed to make this bigger, you can extend by however much distance you want, keep it as one offset. You don't necessarily need an internal line. The internal line just traces the original line. You wouldn't really need that unless you're adding frills or something else on top of this. But notice that by default, it spreads out the center back seam, which we would not want. So you can change that to extend, and that'll keep that center back seam straight. And you should see the pattern update. It's probably going to be dragging on the floor. A lot of crazy stuff is going to happen. This is the nature of working with polygons instead of fabric. They will phase in and out of each other, but simulate and then just give it some time because it's going to take a while for it to figure out what it's doing with its life. We're always going to be dragging fabric through limbs when working in CLO. Just the nature of polygons. That's just how it is. You can always reset your pattern pieces. This is a good example of where I might want to go in and reset my pattern pieces if it's just phasing in and out of body parts too much. If for some reason you're seeing something go on like this and it's just getting to be chaos, you can select your piece either using the transform pattern tool or the select move tool in the 3D window. In the 3D window with it highlighted selected, you can right click on that pattern piece and choose reset 2D arrangement. That'll put it back to where it's sitting in the 2D arrangement. I now have to rotate it back into place. It's going to get stuck on our hands again. I'm moving to front view with my number 2 keyboard shortcut, number 5 for the top. There we go. Simulate. So we can still extend our circle skirt, as long as we're using the edit pattern tool to extend the edges. And you can reset the piece if you need to get it back into order, if it's phasing in and out of bits and pieces. It's stuck on our heel here. But if for some reason you wanted to go in and change the hemline on here, don't forget that if you extend this, your center back seam does not extend with it. So you may see here that she's got a big gap in her center back seam. It's not sewn together back here. A few things you can do. You can delete this center back seam and redo it with the free sewing tool, or you can just use your edit sewing tool to click and drag the pre-existing seam sewing relationship to extend it to center back. You should see it sewing up back there, and it should be good to go. Now, let's say I decide I don't want this hem to be flat. I want to make it a handkerchief skirt or something like that, and I'll show you the handkerchief skirt in the next video. But let's say I want to change the shape of the skirt. Maybe I want a like scalloped edge or something crazy or an asymmetrical design. I can quickly, with the edit pattern tool, I can click and drag these 2 points out of center back and extend them. Whoops. I can extend them, for example, if I wanted to make a train out of the back. I just have to wait for it to phase its way back up through the floor. But you can quickly add a train or something like that, but you'll see how it kind of distorts the shape of it. It comes to kind of a point in center back. If I decided that I wanted to smooth out this curve, I can do that. But let me show you what has happened by creating this internal circle and then expanding it out. If I go over here to the Edit Pattern tool, click and hold it, and choose the Edit Curve Point tool, you're going to see all of these little orange dots around the edge. You'll also see them in the internal circle where that waistline circle was. All of these individual curve points can be moved and modified to change the curve of this line. I can zoom in here, but you'll see as I click and hold this, it starts doing some crazy stuff. And I don't want to have to go in here and modify each one of these points to change the hem of this garment. So it can be a little tricky when working with those curve points, which is why I don't recommend this method for drafting out a circle skirt, because making modifications to the hem becomes kind of a pain. Now you can select these curve points, right click on them with the Edit Curve Point tool and choose Delete Points, but then it just creates a straight line. You can then go back in and add some points back to then create the curve if you feel confident being able to create a nice curved shape, which I think looks a little bit better than this does for this train of a dress. But that's a little bit to have to do. But it's the one way. I haven't found a method yet for cleaning up these curve points. If I decided I wanted to select these and then just clean them up and kind of remove excess curve points, I haven't seen a way to do that yet, rather than going in and manually deleting each curve point. What we should be doing when drafting out a circle skirt, however, would be all those techniques for, I'm just undoing my work here, measuring the measuring the radius or the diameter of our waistline circle, adding the length that we want the skirt to be, and then creating one large circle and then taking a tiny circle out of it. Which is quite a bit of math to do. And if you're a fan of numbers like I am, it's no big deal to just kind of go in and calculate how wide this larger circle should be across its diameter. But if you don't like all the mathematics of it, we can let CLO kind of do the math for us. We've already drafted this, but we want to be able to have a nice clean circle with few curve points. So we can use the next tool I want to show you, which is the Point of Measure tool. That's this guy here. Looks like a ruler with a segment attached to it. And I can click once over here with one vertex, and you'll see there's a little helper next to my mouse saying double click to complete. So I'm going to go across to the other side, double click. That'll give me the diameter of this entire circle, which is 89.722. So then I would be able to go over here with my ellipse tool, click once, create a circle that's 89.722 inches, press enter. It's now the same size as that circle we just made, but it has much fewer curve points. And these are a lot easier to manipulate if you wanted to change the shape of that hem for whatever reason. I then have to put my internal circle in here. So here with the internal polygon line tool, I can click and hold that to get to the internal ellipse tool. That's R on your keyboard for shortcuts. And as I hover inside of this circle, you'll see as I get close to the center, it kind of snaps in place for me. And I can click once to bring up this window, and I can tell it my circumference was 29.5 because I had a 3/4 inch seam allowance on either side of center back. And I want to make sure that all these numbers are the same. Position center, because I do want it in the center, and all these numbers should be the same because they should already be snapped into the circle, to the center of the circle. But it's not to say that you have to have your waistline here in the center. You may want to stick it over here somewhere, or, see what that does to change the shape of that circle skirt. What happens when you move the waistline off center? What kind of shape does it produce? With my transform pattern tool, I can select that internal circle, right click on it, and choose convert to whole. Then I get my waistline back, and I'm going to go ahead with my internal line tool, that's G on the keyboard. Click once, double click up here, and that will give me my center back seam with the edit pattern tool. That's Z on the keyboard. Right click on that center back seam, center back line, and offset as internal line, 0.75 on either side, both sides. Click OK. Make sure that it intersects with the waistline, just dragging those individual points. Shift, click either of those, right click on that line, and cut. Transform pattern tool, that's A on the keyboard. Select that little sliver, get rid of it. So now we've got two identical patterns, but this one has far fewer curve points to change. That's really useful if you're doing modifications to the hem and whatnot, but it's the exact same pattern piece, just a little bit easier to manipulate without so many curve points in there, and that's the proper way to draft your circle skirt. You've also seen the point of measure tool, which you will definitely need to use in future when creating tech packs. So you can take multiple measurements, you can mark out the length of the skirt and the diameters and radii that you might need for drafting this information. Take plenty of POMs, points of measure, so you know the size that your garment should be. So next, I'll show you how to go about drafting a circle skirt with more than one seam, and we'll take a look at how we can modify this into a handkerchief skirt or a tiered skirt.